I am really focused on how humans create technologies to overcome their own physical limitations and then use that to interact with the outside world. And what's really cool is almost every single food that we eat requires some level of technology. I've taken all of that and translated it into the kitchen. And I realize how important it is to process food properly so that we can safely uh, use the most amount of nutrition from it for our human bodies.
Mary Ruddick here, and I am very honored today to bring Dr. Bill Schindler, one of my favorite minds out there today. He has been all over the globe. He's really lived like the traditional people have, and with people that are still living the traditional way today. He is the best in the world at proper food preparation and really understands the phrase, it's not what you eat, it's how you eat it. So I'm very honored to bring you here today, Dr. Schindler. Please give us a little introduction about what you've been up to lately.
Sure. Well, listen, I am just as equally honored to be here with you. I love the work that you're doing. I heard about your trip recently with Brian, who was just here, and thank you for having me on and helping me spread this message.
Oh,
So, yeah, I'm the director of the Eastern Shore Food Lab here at Washington College. My background, I'm an archaeologist, I'm a primitive technologist, and I'm a chef. And I use all of those things together. You know, all those things shape the way that I look at the world. And I think most importantly, the way that I feed myself and my family and any of my students. So it's that lens, I think, that helps us, all of us in this sort of ancestral diet community. We have different ways of looking at these things, and one of the things as an archaeologist I do is I take a huge step back and look, through a several million year long lens. But what I love about the approach, what I find valuable about the approach that my family and I take, is that since as an archaeologist, I'm interested in things and technologies, right? The things are the residues of the technologies of people in the past. And as a primitive technologist, and I know that might be a strange term for some of the people watching or listening to this, as a primitive technologist, I am really focused on how humans create technologies to overcome their own physical limitations and then use that to interact with the outside world. And what's really cool is almost every single food that we eat requires some level of technology. And even though for a long time I was grounded in things like just stone tools and primitive fire and building traps and hunting without laddles, I've taken all of that and translated it into the kitchen. And I realize how important it is to process food properly so that we can safely use the most amount of nutrition from it for our human bodies.
I totally agree. I find something I get asked all the time is what is the perfect human diet? I'm sure you do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the hardest thing for me to answer because there's lots of different diets we can be really healthy on. And I think studying archaeology really shows us that. The Mexican diet is so different than the Mongolian diet, which is so different than the myriad of diets throughout Africa. And and yet they all produce these perfectly healthy individuals that become very disease prone once we start messing with that food processing and changing the way that we get that food to the plate. So I'm very excited to talk to you about some places I haven't been because you're far better traveled than I am. I'd love to talk to you about the diet in Mongolia. From what I've read, it's truly fascinating, and you've been there, you've spent a significant amount of time there.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me what the diet looks like and if it's changed at all in these modern times.
That's a great question. Yeah, so Mongolia is one of my favorite places in the world. In fact, I'd hate to say something like that because everywhere that we've been and done work, I've absolutely loved, and the people have been amazing. We've learned so much, and want to just share so much that we've learned. But there's something special about Mongolia. I don't know if it's because parts of Mongolia just as an outsider, when you first walk in, first of all, there's places in Mongolia that are absolutely stunning and breathtaking, and there's places in Mongolia that look from as soon as you see it, sort of desolate, and people carve out incredibly healthy lives, even in some of the most desolate of these areas, and they do it because of what I mentioned earlier, and what we're both talking about is they figured out ways to take resources and transforming them into the most nourishing form possible for their bodies. And the cool thing about Mongolia is, we'll get into a little science here for just a second, but the cool thing about Mongolia is they have a very dairy-based diet, right? Which isn't that strange, right? Because there's a lot of people around the world who, and we see it in places in Africa, certainly the Maasai and Samburu. We see it in places in Europe, where you have a lot of, a long tradition of a massive amount of dairy in the diet. And Mongolia is no different, but the difference with Mongolia is that the lactose intolerance rate in Mongolia is very, very high, right? So in places in Africa and in places in Europe where you have a long-standing, long history with dairy, there have been independent genetic mutations of humans in the populations engaged in that dairy processing or dairy consumption have been a part of, and it's triggered a lactose tolerance into adulthood. So I don't know if you've spoken about this much before, but I'll do a quick piece of it if you don't mind here.
Oh, please do. Yeah, I'd love you to go into it.
So we have this perception today of as modern humans that we are, it's normal to be able to consume dairy into adulthood, and it's not normal for somebody to become lactose intolerant. And it's actually the exact opposite. Mammals, all mammals, and we're called mammals because we drink milk from our mothers, whether it's a horse or a human, or a mouse, we drink milk from our mothers as infants. We have the right biology at that time in our lives. We're producing the right enzymes. Everything about our intestine or digestive tract is set up to consume dairy as infants and do it in a very safe and nourishing way. But what happens when we start, for any mammal, when we start introducing solid foods, we start shutting down those special adaptations to consume that dairy, and they start going away. So for mammals in general, as they grow older, they become less able to safely consume dairy. And humans are no different. The difference about humans is that a long time ago, probably around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, certain populations started consuming larger and larger amounts of milk from other animals as they were growing older. And they were doing it in a way, and through evolution, some of those populations that were focused on dairy consumption started to produce genetic changes in their populations that allowed them to safely consume dairy as adults. And that's the lactose tolerance, right? And today, it's still more uncommon to be lactose intolerant. Somewhere around 65% of adult humans on the planet are lactose intolerant at some level. And so that's a very small percentage that actually are lactose tolerant. So places in Africa, places in Europe seem to have a higher percentage of lactose tolerance, and places like populations like Native Americans, for example, in North America, very low percentage of lactose tolerance. In fact, it shows that they never really consumed a lot of massive amounts of dairy as adults through the past several thousand years. They never created a genetic mutation that allowed them to do it in response. Now, here's the crazy thing about Mongolia. Oh, a quick side note, though. I spent a lot of time in Ireland. I absolutely love Ireland. That's another one of my favorite places in the world for completely different reasons. But Ireland, it's hard to I say, what is an Irish person, right? What does that mean? But what the studies have shown is that, somebody that has long, genetic roots in Ireland, for those sorts of people, there's almost 100% lactose tolerance. In fact, Ireland has the highest lactose tolerant population in the entire world, which just speaks to the amount of dairy they've consumed over a long period of time. Okay, so that all sort of makes a little bit of sense. But then we go to Mongolia. Now, Mongolia, huge, long-standing tradition with dairy. Still today is a major, important part of their diet. And we could talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But the crazy thing about Mongolia is they've never produced that genetic mutation for lactose tolerance into adulthood. In fact, many people in Mongolia, despite the amount of dairy they consume and rely on in their diets, are lactose intolerant. And the difference is that or the thing that allows them to do that is they actually process the dairy properly. They mimic all of the things that happen inside of your body when you're supposed to be, when you're prepared to safely and efficiently consume that dairy. They do those things outside of their body before they consume it. In fact, they don't need to be lactose tolerant in order to safely consume it. They don't need that genetic mutation to allow them to safely do it because they're processing the dairy properly. So real quick, just again, if I'm not going too long on this, I'll just
no rush on this. This is such an important topic you're discussing. Okay. So yes, please.
This is what, in fact, to go back to that earlier question you had, you said people ask you all the time, what is the perfect human diet, or what is the ideal human food? The only food that humans are designed to consume is dairy. And we're only designed to consume it when we're infants. I mean, that is the perfect raw dairy from our mothers. That is the only food that humans are literally designed or adapted to consume. And then, obviously, we lose that ability as we get older, but that's it. And the rest of it requires technology, which is another conversation. But real quick, this is what happens with dairy when as infants, when you're a baby and you're consuming dairy, this is how it works. So we drink the milk from our mothers, and the milk is coming out from our mothers not only raw but teeming with live bacteria, and it's coming out at a temperature. This is all very important. It's coming out at a temperature that is perfectly suited for the bacteria, the good bacteria that is in that milk. It's coming out with a high level of cholesterol, a whole bunch of high quality fat, prebiotics, probiotics. It's amazing. It's the perfect food. And when we consume it as infants, it goes into it as soon as it goes into our bodies, it's in our digestive tract. It starts to get hit with several different enzymes that allow us to properly process that milk so that we can get nutrition from it. One of the enzymes is lipase, which helps break down the fat. One of the enzymes is lactase, which helps break down the sugars, lactose. One of the enzymes is something, it depends on the animal, but a chymosin or chymosin-like enzyme, which actually coagulates the milk. And the reason that it's important to coagulate the milk is because liquids, especially when we're only consuming liquids, pass through our digestive tract entirely too fast for us to break it down properly. So we need to slow it down. We need to literally stop it and have it sit there for a little while for a couple of reasons. So when the dairy gets hit with this chymosin, it coagulates, turns into almost like a jello-like substance. And then our digestive tract can chemically and physically break it down properly, and it can sit there and ferment in our guts. And that is a chemical and physical process that helps further break it down and get it ready for our bodies to consume it. And then when it's ready, it'll go through our rest of our digestive tract, go into our small intestines. Our small intestine will derive the nutrition that's already been broken down and ready for our body, and the rest of it will pass, it'll pass through. Well, when we get older, we cease the production of, most of us, of lactase, which breaks down the sugar, and that's when you become lactose intolerant. As soon as we introduce solid foods into our bodies, we cease the production of chymosin, so we can no longer slow it down and allow it to ferment properly. And then on top of that, most people in the modern world are eating, or if we're consuming dairy, it's ultra pasteurized, homogenized dairy from animals that are fed on things that they're not supposed to be fed on. But if we think about that entire process, and then we think about the process of fermenting dairy on a countertop in our kitchens, making something like cheese or kefir or yogurt, we're actually replicating the same exact process that happened in our bodies. That chymosin enzyme in the cheese making world is known as rennet. So if you're making a real traditional raw milk cheese, you're actually replicating the exact process that happened in your body when you drank mother from your milk when you were, 1 month old. And we eat cheese today because we like the flavor, we like the texture, we like the aroma. And there's obviously, you understand why. We're hardwired to like that anyhow. And but the value of the cheese making process or the dairy fermentation process is that it is doing what your body did when you were young, so that you can safely derive the right nutrition from it. When we ferment the dairy, several things happen, but one of the things that happens is that the lactose gets broken down, right? The lactobacillus bacteria that do the fermentation actually take the sugar lactose, break it into glucose and galactose, and it feeds off it. So the longer the fermentation happens, believe it or not, the lower the lactose level goes, because the food for the fermentation is actually the sugars in the milk. So here we go back to Mongolia. And here, what are these people doing? They're not sitting there milking their yaks or milking their mares into a cup and then eating it with, cereal in the morning, or putting it into a glass of milk and drinking it. They're not doing that. They're taking that milk and they're fermenting it. They're taking the cream from the yak milk and fermenting it, making this They take the yak milk butter, and they wrap it inside of the stomachs of the yaks after they butcher the yaks, and they ferment it sometimes for months and create a completely different food. Yeah, and I know I'm probably way too long on the dairy thing, but the reason I bring it up is because we ask questions like, what should we be eating? And we say, okay, well, should we eat butter? Should we drink milk as adults? It really doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And should we do this? And those conversations are destined for failure, because so what are you talking about? Are you talking about fermented yak butter in Mongolia? Or are you talking about the cheap butter that's cut with canola oil in the grocery store? Are you talking about ultra pasteurized, homogenized skim milk from a grass-fed cow? Or are you talking about some of this amazing fermented dairy products that are out on the steppe on the completely different foods?
Completely. Yeah, I had that experience growing up. I grew up thinking I was allergic to dairy until I did the GAPS diet, where you can only do kind of local cultured dairies. You have to make them yourself, your butter, your cheese, your ghee. You can't drink milk. It has to be a cultured product. And then I realized I could have as much dairy as I wanted, and I enjoyed it so much. And now I think that's all I have at home is the good stuff. And because of that, I have no issue eating it at a restaurant or anything else. And yeah, I think it gives you a great tolerance, but that's something I've been such a champion of as well, is that dairy can be an incredible health food. And it's not something to just write off. It's something to look deeper into and see what kind of quality you're getting. Because so many times I get someone, they're very low in the fat soluble vitamins, the A, D, and K. And dairy is kind of a superfood for that, if it's the proper kind of dairy, if it's the grass-fed and the cultured and the right breed and all those kinds of things.
And then we look at when we were doing work in Ireland, we did a lot of dairy work in Ireland. It looks like, by the way, butter was probably invented in Ireland, probably around 6,000 years ago, and seems to have spread by the Vikings throughout Europe after that. It's really, they used to take butter and bury it in there's something called bog butter in Ireland, thousands of years old, this butter, and they take butter, make a bunch of butter, put it in these really intricately carved wooden vessels, and then bury them in the bogs. And nobody really knows why they did it. And they're found all over Ireland. I think there's been 500 or maybe even more found to date, thousands of years old. And some people think it might be for storage. Some people think it might be for hiding. Some people think it might be ritualistic purposes. I think there was something else going on because of the pH of the bog. But whatever it was, they were doing it, making massive amounts of this butter. But the butter was always fermented. And it was by default. And if you think about how people used to make butter, even in colonial America, right, whenever it was, nobody really had 50 cows, right? You had a cow or a couple cows or a yak in Mongolia or whatever. And I even saw it in Mongolia. You milk the animal, and then you put it in a vessel. And it's separated over time, over several hours a day or so. You get the separation where it depends on the animal and the type of milk, but you get the fat would separate to the top, and then you skim it off. But you don't have enough fat cream usually from one or two animals that it makes sense to make butter, because butter is a labor-intensive process. So you sit it over there, right? And then the next day, or later that night, you milk the cows. You do it again and again. And 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days later, you have enough cream that it makes sense to sit there and go ahead and make butter out of, right? And you make butter one time a week or whatever. And that what you don't realize is that entire time, that is live, incredibly bacteria and good bacteria rich cream that is fermenting that entire time. So by the time you make the butter, it's been fermented, right? By default, it has. And then you make the butter and you've made fermented butter. And what's cool about fermented butter is, number one, it's less labor intensive to make butter after you've fermented the cream than it is to do it from fresh cream, because all the fat molecules are surrounded by a thin membrane, and that membrane repels the fat from the other fat molecules. And then, but when you ferment it, you're chemically and physically changing that cream, including breaking down that membrane. So when it's time to actually churn the butter, however you're churning it, you can do so with less work. The membrane's already been compromised, so you get a higher yield with less work. You have an increase in flavor, an increase in aroma, and then you also have all the other health benefits of a fermented dairy product. So even with butter, if you're going to go buy a sweet cream butter from the grocery store in America, my number one choice is something like Kerrygold from Ireland. These are grass-fed cows, really high quality butter, but that's still a sweet cream butter, and that's about the best you can buy. Every now and then you can get a couple of cultured European, which is a fermented butter, but again, completely different foods. But here's the thing. So we're in Ireland doing a bunch of work on dairy and butter and these sorts of things. And we were hooked up with a small, really cool dairy called the Village Dairy, small dairy out in the middle of the country. And we were working with them, and I didn't realize how at an industrial scale, when milk comes into the facility, it's broken apart. It's like a science experiment. It's broken apart into all its different pieces. You get the milk over here, you get certain solids over here, you get the fat over here, the vitamins, all these things. It gets split apart into all these places, in all these constituents, and then they say, okay, well, how do I recombine this for the maximum amount of profit? And depending on where you are in the world, right, you have all these different minimum amounts of whatever have to go back into the milk. So skim milk, or 2% milk, or 5% milk, or not 5%, but whatever percent. And then whole milk even is less than the fat that was all in it. So I don't know if whole milk here is like 3.2, 3.4%. They recombine this milk, and it's pasteurized and then usually homogenize and put it over here. They take most of the cream and sell that off for a higher profit for butter or for ice cream or for just selling it as cream. Then they sell some of the other things off to the health food industry. And here you are as a consumer, like, what am I consuming? You think you're consuming this healthy product, but it's actually Franken milk by the time you get it. And the craziest part is they pasteurize this milk. They kill off the vitamin A. They kill off the vitamin D. They've taken all the fat out of it. Then they artificially put the vitamin A and the vitamin D back into skim milk, which has no fat to allow you to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. And they put a little label on it and say, hey, this is fortified with vitamin A and D. And you think, hey, great, but you drink it and it's going directly through your body. Completely. It is the most bastardized.
Vitamins.
What's that?
You can't even absorb those vitamins.
No. But the problem with milk is that as a consumer, we go into the grocery store, and it even says, I was in the grocery store the other day at Acme over here by us, and it says wholesome dairy over the top of it. And you look in the case, and there's hundreds of different offerings, or sometimes thousands, hundreds of different offerings. And the only thing missing from it is actually milk. Right? Everything else in it. And we have this image that it's been unadulterated and it's a basic food and it's like it came out of the cow, and it's not at all. So anyhow, back to the real quick with the Mongolia thing, they ferment their dairy, they ferment their butter, they make a variety of different cheeses, they make a variety of different fermented dairy products that are also then air dried on top of their gers or their yurts. They even make a beer called Erig out of mare's milk. Mare's milk, horse milk, is super cool because it has.
Sorry, wait, back up. This is incredible. This is something I don't know about. So
you don't know about the beer? Oh, no. So mares, certainly different milk from different animals have different amounts of fat, different amounts of sugar, right? And all these. But the cool thing about mare's milk, it has a very high amount of sugar in the milk. And that's good for making alcohol. I'm sorry?
So you can ferment it very easily. That's amazing.
Absolutely. So they make this beer, low percentage. It's like, I don't know, 2.5, 3% alcohol. I mean, it's nothing huge, but it's enough. And it's so they ferment it. But then what's also cool is a lot of these gears, and I mean, some of these gears are 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, right? They're out in the middle of nowhere on the steppe. And many of them have a little still. So they'll actually make this beer, this erig, and then some of them will actually ferment, or I'm sorry, distill that into a horse milk vodka, which is interesting. I brought some home in a Gatorade bottle, or, a Gatorade squeeze bottle, in a water bottle that I had, and I fed it to my family, and my kids were really young at the time, and my son, he nailed it. He nailed it because it doesn't look like vodka like that. It's that clear. It's a little cloudy, which is supposed to. And he said it smelled and tasted like liquid blue cheese. So, so I don't know if that makes you excited or not, but if it makes you excited.
So. I'm always excited to try something new, and I've never heard of an alcohol being made out of a dairy product. So yeah, I'm in. I will definitely try.
We'll do it together.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, I've really found the same. In fact, what I've loved about traveling so much is that most of the regions that probably you've gone to as well, when I go to them, they have their local butter, and it's usually just from like a mile within where they're from. And this is still just normal to them. It's not specialized. And the butters all taste so different. Like the first time I ever had a goat butter that didn't taste like goat butter was in Greece. It tasted like the most delectable French grass-fed cow butter. And it wasn't. It was from goat, but it had none of the goaty taste. It was really an artisan butter. But for them, it's just their normal, like, well, we just make this weekly kind of thing. Yeah. Yes.
We were the strongest butter I would have thought it'd be the yak butter, but the strongest butter I ever had was actually, we were in Ethiopia, southern part of Ethiopia, in a Bali Mountain area, up in the mountains in the bamboo forest. And I remember the group we were, the leader's name was Haji, and he said, "You have to try our butter." And he brought this gorgeous carved wooden container out with this woven lid, and he opened this. And I mean, as soon as he opened it, you could smell it from 50 feet away, and it was strong. I think you'd probably call it rancid.
Yeah.
Most people would, but it was a taste and it was a flavor and a texture and an aroma that they actually enjoyed and loved, and they ate that's how they ate it. I think any butter younger than that would have not tasted right to them. And I did enjoy it, but it was different. It was strong.
We've got to get that studied. I'm trying to set up a food lab here so that we can properly break down, find out what the lectins, the probiotics, all that kind of stuff are in some of these foods, so that when we go and visit these areas, we can bring them back and study them. But yeah, Ethiopia has so many fascinating diets. And I think it's one of the most interesting African countries because they're the only one that was never successfully colonized. So there's a lot more intact history throughout Ethiopia. And their tribes their communities are all so different with their diets, like the false banana to the more carnivore types, and lots of fermentations throughout that country from what I've seen. Yes.
Have you seen the book Fermented Foods of the Sudan?
No.
I saw it for the first time years ago and looked through it and was floored, and I haven't looked at it again since. But what floored me the most, and it's one of the great, it's a super thick book, and it's comprehensive, but I'm sure it's not fully comprehensive. But if you look at it and open it up, it's like an encyclopedia. I had no idea this many different foods were all fermented, all in just one location, and it's amazing. It's fermented foods are, it permeate. I haven't found a group in the world anywhere that doesn't ferment something at the core of its traditional diet.
Oh, that's incredible. I will buy that today and start reading it immediately. Immediately. Well, I have to ask you, with your love
Sure.
for Ireland, I have a random question for you. So traditionally when I work with my patients, usually they're very, very sick. So we'll start them on maybe like more of a Maasai type diet or Hadza type diet, and then move them on to maybe like a Chaga or a Brazilian type diet as they can tolerate starches and more foods and
Hmm.
these kind of things. But I usually have them do the long fermentation methods or the process to, open up the niacin in the corn once they hit remission and these kind of things. But one that I don't usually go to is considered an Irish food, and I would love to know your take on it. Usually I don't let people go back to oats because of the lectin content, but I'm sure and also the history, which maybe you would know a lot more of than I would. My understanding is probably wrong, and that is that oats were not traditionally a long-standing food just for the few hundred years outside of like mostly for horses, and then used for kind of to punish groups of people. So in in the biblical times, they would be fed to the Jewish slaves and these kind of things, or to gladiators. Is any of that true about oats, or what's your take on oats?
First of all, your fear of oats is completely understandable and completely spot on. But it's the same fear that I would have with wheat and anything else. And again, I'm probably mimicking something that you've already said 1,000 times. But here's the like basis for all the work that I do, and it sounds like for a lot of what you do as well. The Humans are not designed to eat almost any single food that we eat. We are literally, in my mind, if we look back to the archaeological record and begin at pre-tool, pre-food processing, the foods that we were consuming, which you could then potentially make an argument to say, okay, well, if those are the ones we're consuming with no tools and we're surviving and reproducing viable offspring and doing okay, then maybe those are the foods we're supposed to designed to eat. Are insects, a very limited amount of wild vegetables, and a very limited amount of wild fruits, and potentially there's some suggestion that there was a little bit, and I'm talking like 5-7 million years ago, there's potentially the fact that or evidence for we were doing a little tiny bit of small mammal like hunting, like whatever we could catch with our hands, small rodent like things, not necessarily adding a whole lot to our diets. And if you looked at our ancestors, then full grown, about 3.5 feet tall, huge difference in the size between males and females. Females were a lot smaller. Our brains were, the size of my fist, very small, low nutritional requirements to support and maintain those bodies and those smaller populations. So that's what we're designed to eat. And so immediately, I'm sure all the carnivore keto people are, pissed off because they're thinking, wait, where's all the meat? Where's all? But hold on, I'm getting there, I promise. But this is a really hard concept to understand. That's what we were designed to eat at that time, 5 million years ago, 7 million years ago, with a digestive tract of that size and supporting, and everything that we did was literally with our fingers and our teeth and our digestive tract. There was no food processing happening. We had no tools to do anything before we ate that food. We relied on our digestive tract, like all other animals do. That's how we work. And then about 3.5 million years ago, we started making our first tools. And even though it was a simple stone tool that took less than a second to make, it was transformative because it allowed our ancestors, for the first time ever, to overcome these physical limitations and do brand new things, get new resources, process that food, in a completely different ways. And we started 3.5 million years ago doing outside of our bodies what other animals do inside of their bodies that are adapted to those sorts of diets, right? So it started with butchering carcasses on the African savannah that other animals, scavenging. We became scavengers ourselves because we had the tools that allowed us to hack off huge pieces of flesh. And then at around 2 million years ago, we developed technologies, fire and hunting technologies. That the difference between hunting and scavenging, a huge one, is that we now had access to the most nutrient dense bioavailable parts of the animals, the blood, the fat, and the organs, in addition to the meat. And then, we just continued creating all these different technologies. Whether a lot of it was revolving around fermentation, but things like fermentation or nixtamalization or stoking or sprouting or cooking or whatever we were doing. So as we continued to create these technologies, it allowed us to access new nutrients from our environment that we couldn't access with just our fingers and our teeth, and our really limited bodies. And most importantly, to take these foods that we had no biological business eating and transforming them into their safest and most nourishing form possible. And we did such a good job at this that we not only could support our bodies, but they grew. They grew in size. Our bodies grew bigger with more nutritional requirements. Our brains exponentially grew in size with more nutritional requirements. But what didn't change is our digestive tract. We did such a great job of doing the digestive work outside of our bodies and getting that food in its most nutrient-dense, bioavailable form possible, that we didn't have to rely on our digestive tract any longer, and it didn't have to grow in proportion to our body size. So one of the crazy things, if you look through time of our evolutionary history, is our bodies grew, our brains grew, but our teeth shrunk in size, and in proportion to our body, our digestive tract shrunk in size. Our digestive tract now is 60% the size of what it would be in a similar sized primate, which blows my mind when I think about it. But it really speaks to the power of technology and processing food for the purpose of making food safe and nourishing as possible. Now, the hard things about the everything I just said is that, number one, I said the word food processing like 15 times. And it isn't the same thing as food processing to make things like Twinkies or whatever today. The food processing today is for things like profit and shelf life and uniformity and all those sorts of things at the expense of safety and nutrients. Food processing in the past was the exact opposite. That's number one. The second hard thing to wrap our brains around is that even though we're not designed, and I know there's going to be people who are upset about this, but I'm telling you, we are not designed to eat meat. We are not designed to eat grains. We are not designed to consume dairy as adults. Those are facts, right? But that's not where the conversation should stop. We built bodies, brains, populations on the backs of diets that included those foods. But the difference is, it's not about the food, it's about the processing. We included, we don't, yes, I know there is things like the carrier hypothesis, and, we can run an animal down to death. I know that, the distance, the long distance hunts and those sorts of things, yes, we can do it, right? It can be done. People still do it today. We have evidence for it. But the reality is, doing that, by the time you've taken the animal down, right, it's 3 people running all day in the heat, and you're a marathon away from your village. I mean, it isn't a consistent source of food that's going to grow our bodies and brains and populations, right? We require hunting in order to do it. We require tools in order to do it properly at a level that's going to make a difference. So it's about the technology to transform these foods that our bodies have no business eating into the most safest and most nourishing form possible to support the bodies and brains that we have today. So the technology piece is important here. So now we get back to the oats. Should we be eating oats? No. I mean, if you think there's technology involved with hunting an animal and butchering it properly and doing all the things we need to do to, break it down, and that's a little bit of technology. To get a field ready and plant the oats and tend the oats and harvest the oats and process the oats and eat the oats, that's a massive amount of technology. But the important part of the technology with oats is what happens once you have the oats in your hand and you're in your kitchen. What are you supposed to do to those oats before you eat them if they're going to be part of a safe and nourishing diet? Well, the answer is oats, like any other grain or grain, seed, legume, what have you, are inherently dangerous. There's anti-nutrients, there's lectins, there's oxalates, all sorts of issues with it. And we know this is the case. But if you look traditionally in Ireland, now looking at Ireland today is not a great example, because just like most places in the world, convenience and fast-paced lifestyles and those sort of things have certainly crept in and changed the way that oats, something like an oat, a traditional food in Ireland, is consumed. If you go back just even 2 generations, you ate oats in the morning, but you put them on to soak overnight, like period. Like the oats were always soaked beforehand, and then you ate them the next day. And then now it's different because, well, again, convenience and, oh my God, it's just one extra step. And, it was one generation that maybe weren't doing it. And even that overnight soak makes a huge difference with helping to detoxify and begin to break down those oats to get them into a state that's a lot safer than they are just eating them raw or even eating them cooked. I don't know if that helped at all, but soaking
does. Because I've thought for quite some time, in general, grains, at least from my understanding, the reason why they were a traditional part of many regions of the world was that you could remove a lot of the plant toxins through processing. So whether that was through fermentation, soaking, sprouting, stone grinding, all of these methods, processing with lye, depending on what we're talking about. And so I've thought for some time that oats are probably in that category, but not knowing, I haven't allowed it because I don't know the reduction of the lectin. Unlike with gluten, which is another lectin for those of you listening, right. You ferment a proper sourdough for 48, 72 hours is my preferred if you've had a health issue in the past, and it brings the gluten content down from 72,000 parts per million down to 12, and the human body can handle 12 of most things. It can handle a small amount of toxins, and it may even benefit us as well. So for my people in remission and for myself as well, that's the way I eat, right? I eat that traditionally fermented foods, whatever they are. So this weekend, actually, do you know Farmer Angus in South Africa?
No, sounds like I should, though. Tell me.
I have to introduce you to. He's like the Joel Salatin of Africa. He's really amazing, and he's very into biodynamic farming, and he's just done wonderful things for bringing ancestral food to the table here throughout Africa. And I was hanging out at his wife's family owns Spear Wineries, and so I was there, and we went to one of the restaurants on the property, and they had a fermented sourdough pizza crust with bone marrow. It was to die for. And then they had the properly fermented croissants and all these kinds of lovely things. And so yeah, I've wondered if oats were in that category. I will, when I set my food lab up, we'll test the lectin content and the reduction. If someone hasn't already, if anyone listening can tell us what it is, that's great. And then I will allow my my folks in remission to enjoy that. What about, I feel it would be remiss if we didn't go over corn, and I would love if we could talk about your duck insight as to how you you came across this, because one thing that I've tried to convey is that there are cultures in South America, in Mexico, that really had a very high carbohydrate diet, and it was but the processing of the foods were very, very important, and that's why you can have a healthy population on, say, a lot of corn, or a healthy population on a carnivore diet. It's very much the processing and that kind of thing. So so tell us about the duck and the corn insight.
Well, please, real quick, the more that you talk, your clients are so incredibly lucky to have you. I mean, your approach to seriously, your approach is unbelievable, and thank you for everything that you're doing. It's fantastic.
Oh, thanks, ditto. It helps me so much to be able to send people to you to watch your videos and take your classes, because you really teach people how, once they've gained their health, to maintain it. And for all my like family members and family members of clients who are already healthy, I tell them to eat exactly how you're teaching people to do. So I love having you as a resource to send people.
It means a lot. It means a ton. And I'll tell you, that's so incredibly important, because I think there's so many pieces. I love to sit down and have a real in-depth conversation like this, because there's so many nuances that become so important. Like, for example, that conversation about, we're not designed to eat this, but we have to eat these things now processed properly because we've built these bodies on things we're not supposed to. It's a weird conversation, but it takes a while to get that all out. Another thing that's really important here, and since we're talking about sourdough, and like a lot of people come back at the suggestion that sourdough can even be part of a healthy diet. And they're like, no, it can't. Why would you tell somebody to eat sourdough? And it's very important that I'm not suggesting that if you don't want to eat bread, got it. Like, you can have an incredibly healthy diet without bread whatsoever. But if you do want to eat bread, or you do want to feed your kids bread, there's a way to do it that is incredibly healthy. And there's a way to do it that can make them sick, or continue to make them sick. And something like sourdough falls into that category. Sourdough bread is completely different than any other bread that you get.
1,000% yes. Yes.
Again, I'm not advocating sourdough, but I'm advocating, if you're going to eat bread, that's definitely the bread you should be eating.
Fully agree.
So the duck thing, that actually happened in Ireland. We were at a place by this gorgeous waterfall, and we were filming for an episode in a television series called What Are You Eating? And it had just gone into its third season, and they had contacted me. This is the year we were there. This is a few years ago. And they said, listen, we're going to do we're starting to film a new season. We're doing an episode. We'd like you to be on it. I said, okay, great. What is it about? And they said, veganism. And I said, I don't know that much about veganism. I don't know if I could add that much to it. And they're like, no. This is what we're going to have you do. I promise this gets back to the bread. So they said, the host is gonna get all this blood work done, and then he's gonna go on a completely vegan diet for a month. And during that month, he's gonna go and interview a bunch of the leaders in the vegan movement in Ireland, which at the time was incredibly strong. And then at the end of the month, and I know a month's not too long, but at the end of the month, he's going to get blood work done again. And then he's going to go out with you, and maybe you can have some of your stone tools, and you can walk through, show how to make them. And because they were so important to butchering and our introduction to introducing animals into our diets in the past. And then maybe you can walk us through kind of the prehistory of us humans consuming animals. And then maybe you can butcher something with some of the tools you make. I said, great. And I had a couple of students, because I was teaching at University College Dublin that year as well. So I had a couple of graduate students, and I said, can I bring the students out? He's like, absolutely. And a really good friend of mine named Jason O'Brien, who runs Odeus Foods in Ireland, a top-notch, high-quality food production and distribution company. I said, can you get me some animals? He's like, yes, what do you want? I said, I want 2 deer, I want 2 ducks, and I want 2 rabbits. And he's like, done. And he shows up with all these animals. So the film crew comes out, beautiful waterfall in the back. I got some stone tools started. I got students that are kneeling down next to these animals, and they're butchering with stone tools. I mean, it was set up perfect, but it was a lot going on. And I was concentrating on not sounding silly on TV, right? But I want to make sure the students aren't cutting themselves with these razor sharp tools, and everything's going well. And the host is walking, I'm walking the host through the prehistory of stone tools and hunting and butchering and things. And then he's like, hey, can you grab one of those tools and cut open that duck? I said, sure. I said, on camera? He's like, sure. I said, okay. And these ducks had just been killed. They had everything in them still. And as a precursor to this, the 2 days before this, we had taken a group of chefs from Google up to County Mayo up in the northwest coast of Ireland, and did a several-day program with them. And that was actually the area that butter was probably invented, but we were grinding on stone tools called a quern, and doing a bunch of different things with them. So this was in the back of my mind. And I got students butchering and hopefully not cutting themselves, and a film crew and a host, and I'm sitting there and people are watching, and I'm trying not to sound silly. And I pick up this duck, and I grab this stone flake, and I cut it open at the bottom, and I reached up all the way inside of this duck, like all the way up to and I pulled everything out, and everything was laying on my arm. And at that moment, when I looked down at the organs, a couple of things, there was a huge light bulb moment, which was awesome. And it forms the foundation of how I think about sourdough and grains in general. But the problem was, like, can you imagine having this amazing light bulb moment, and then you're still trying to navigate everything that's happening around you? So this is what happened. When I reached up, I grabbed just below his throat, and I grabbed everything. And the first kind of part of the organ of his digestive tract, his or her digestive tract, was a crop. Now, technically, a duck doesn't have a crop. They have an enlarged esophagus something or another, but we'll call it a crop for this conversation. And when a duck and other granivorous birds are designed to consume grains, like their body, their digestive tract is designed to consume grains. So I would use them as a model for how you safely and efficiently break down a grain in order to get the nutrition from it. So what happens is when they eat the grain, they eat the grain and it goes into this enlarged pouch in their esophagus. And it sits there sometimes for like 16 hours. And think about what's happening. This grain is sitting in a warm, moist environment, sometimes for the better part of half a day. And during that time, it soaks, it ferments, and depending on how long it's been there, it sometimes even starts to sprout. And that's huge, because anybody who's dealt with grains at all know that those are the 3 ways to detoxify a grain, right? We do it in a mason jar on our counter. This duck or the goose or whatever is doing it inside of their body. And then only then, after it's been properly broken down and detoxified, the grains go down. And the next thing that they hit is called the gizzard. And anybody who's opened up a turkey for Thanksgiving or bought a chicken at the store that still has the innards, they have gizzards. And a gizzard is made up of 2 muscular discs like this. And in between those discs, the birds, they eat something called gastroliths, which means digestive rocks. But they actually eat bits of sand and grit and little rocks on purpose. And they eat them, and it goes down, and they sit in between these muscular discs. So when the soaked, fermented, sometimes sprouted grain goes in between these muscles, it actually gets ground, stone ground in between those muscles. And then, and only then, does that grain go into the rest of the digestive tract, which is where the nutrients actually get absorbed. And I'm looking at this thinking to myself, oh my God, like other than baking, they've literally made sourdough bread. That's exactly what they've done. They used a bacterial fermentation. They've stone ground it. They've detoxified it. They've broken it down. And so that hits my mind like, oh my God, that's exactly what we do when we make a real traditional sourdough bread. That's exactly what happens when I'm soaking oats or something else overnight before we would eat it the next day. So then the other thing that hits me at the moment is, God, I wish I could know what happened if we bypass that, because those are 2 parts of a digestive tract we don't have. So we can't take the same grain and do the same thing that duck did. We're at a disadvantage because we have to do it outside of our body. I'm thinking to myself, what if I was able to take a grain, bypass the crop and the gizzard, and stick it in the digestive tract that the rest of it operates much like ours does, and see what happens? And I'm like, God, I'll never know. I'll never know if they get sick or if they died or if they're malnourished. But a couple of years ago, I saw an article on a disease called angel wing, and it happens to ducks and geese in city parks around the world, where it's so cute. You see the old people, and they have the bag of Wonder Bread, and they feed the ducks the bread, and it looks cute, and we post Instagram pictures about it or whatever. But the reality is, it's very dangerous, and these birds get malnourished as a result of it. They get a nutrient deficiency disease called angel wing, and they get these deformed wings and things. And what happens is, it's crazy, and it speaks to the processing. If you put a raw grain in a duck's mouth or a bird's mouth, they can go through that bacterial fermentation process, and the soaking works and all that. But if you've actually taken that grain, stripped it of its nutrients, cooked it into a yeasted bread like Wonder Bread, it no longer has the ability to break down properly. So these ducks are eating, for all intents and purposes, a food, the basic ingredient of what they're designed to eat, but they're getting sick because it's processed in a modern human way, and they can't use their digestive tract properly. Mind-blowing to me.
Mind-blowing. That is actually fascinating, because birds, anybody who works in our fields will know that birds can break down seeds and grains. They're the one animal that can break down lectins. But this is a clear point that even they can't do it if it bypasses their necessary digestive stages of the stone grinding, the soaking, the sprouting, the same things we have to make it healthy for ourselves.
Sure.
Fascinating.
So yeah, and I'll say this, and just to bring it back to the dairy real quick. Listen, scientific tests on food and the nutrition world, all of that is incredibly important. But I also think at some root level, we can answer questions about how we should feed ourselves and our families, just with common sense. And a lot of for me, when I try to answer questions, should I eat this? Should I be feeding this to my kids? I immediately go back to the past and say, how were things done in the past? What are traditional groups around the world eating today, and how are they processing their food and those sorts of things? And if you understand food, real cooking, I mean the processing of food, like fermentation, for example, or nixtamalization, if you understand those processes, and something is messing up one of those necessary processes, then I question whether or not we should be consuming it. So a great example is the Wonder Bread and the geese and the ducks in the city parks. Like the yeasted bread. I don't want to pick on just Wonder Bread. All of them are equally bad. But there's something wrong. Like if the animal that's designed to consume grains can't safely eat a piece of bread from the grocery store, then we, who are definitely not designed to eat grains, should really stay away from it. But here's another great example. If everything I said about digesting dairy is true, I'm convinced it is, but if it's true and it requires this and when we eat it, consume it as infants, it gets hit with these enzymes and it goes through a fermentation process and creates curds, which is all of those things happen. If that's the necessary steps in order to transform dairy into something that's safe and nourishing for a human body, then and we can take that outside of our bodies and do it on our countertops when we make cheese or yogurt or kefir, okay, that makes sense. But when I'm grabbing a gallon of milk from the grocery store and ultra pasteurized, homogenized milk, you can't make cheese from it. Like, it's impossible to make cheese from it. A curd won't set. It won't ferment properly, even when you reintroduce the bacteria. And to me, it's like, wow, that's another red flag. Like, if that food, if I can't replicate the digestive process on the counter to make real yogurt or cheese or whatever with that milk, then it should never touch my lips,
Totally
infant
agree.
or adult.
Totally agree. Do you know what actually so I went through a big health issue, and when I healed from it, the rule that I put down was that I wasn't going to try anything that wasn't ancestrally based. And that was when I actually healed. I had done 16 diets before that. And when I finally put that rule down, that it had to have an ancestral basis, that's when my body actually healed. And so I make my patients do that too. They're not allowed to get dairy from the store unless they're in a state or a country that allows them to buy the proper, old world style of dairy. They have to make it themselves. And I actually think it's really important. And it makes you kind of, maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I really fell in love with food, and you feel more self-sufficient when you're making things yourself, not dependent upon going somewhere and buying things. And there's something just really lovely about having things in glass containers that you've made yourself. I don't know.
I 100% agree. To me, it's empowering. I love listening to podcasts. I love reading books. I love watching documentaries, and all those things are fantastic. But by learning to make something simple like a yogurt on your own countertop is like, that's empowering. Like, you've just done it yourself. And what I tell a lot of my students is, I have a lot of people that want to learn how to do these things in their own kitchen. And I'll tell you what, every food that any food that can be a part of a healthy human diet, you should be able to make in your own kitchen. I don't care if it's in a tiny little 10-foot square kitchen in New York City or a big palatial, kitchen on a resort somewhere. Like, if you can't do it in your kitchen, then you shouldn't eat it, because we're talking about these ancestral foods. These are done over campfires with sticks and stones and little clay pots. Any kitchen in North America is probably better outfitted than the caves that were outfitted, several thousand years ago. So you should, so a lot of people, most of my students come because they want to learn how to make sourdough bread from scratch, or how to make cheese, or how to butcher a pig, or how to do these things themselves. And some of them go, and that's their lifestyle from that point forward. Like literally they spend, a large part of their time making almost every single thing that their family eats all the time. And that's amazing. But there's also a large number of my students who leave and then say, that was awesome. That was empowering. I don't have the time because of whatever their lifestyle is, because of work or, their kids' schedules or whatever it is. I don't have the time to make it all myself anymore. And I get that. The modern, we're getting pulled in a million different directions, and we have to navigate a real modern world anyhow. So, but what they do is they walk into the grocery store with a completely different set of eyes, right? They can see through it's the most empowering way to walk into a grocery store, because the marketing and the advertising and the labeling means nothing anymore. Like you're walking in there in my mind, for the first time as a completely informed consumer. And okay, 99% of everything sold in here is complete junk, but there's a few people or companies that are doing it right. And that's what I'm going to feed my family. I don't have the time to make it myself, but I know now that I've made it, I know how it's supposed to be made. This is the best thing that I can buy. And I'm going to bring that home, which is awesome. And the second great thing about it is that they're supporting the small food producers who are doing it right with their paychecks.
Completely. Yeah. And I found, having clients worldwide, as I'm sure you do with your classes as well, you can usually find someone in the area that's making the bread correctly or making yogurt from scratch, these kind of things. And then you're able to support them, which is so wonderful. And it's not always the fastest to find them, but if you do some digging, you'll usually be able to find someone in your area that's making all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And they need the support. Yes, they definitely need the support.
They do. And because these things do take a lot of time. So when I was speaking with the man at Spear over the weekend, the genius behind this restaurant, he was saying that he actually loses money in selling the croissants because the croissants take 5 days to make if you make them in the properly real fermented way. And when you do so, it's 50% butter. It's actually a low carb food. And it ferments all the gluten, almost all of the gluten out. They're just really wonderful to taste as well. But he can't sell them for 45 Rand, which is the equivalent of $2 for us each. So he has to lower the price to a point where he actually doesn't even break the bank on his croissants. Wow. But he's still, out of a love for the art of the fermentation, he still makes them and provides them every morning and then makes up for it on other items in the restaurant. So yeah, I actually recommend, if anyone is out there buying it from someone else, pay them a little extra, because the amount of work that goes into these things is more than you can get. You can't price compare to something in the grocery store. You just can't.
Sure.
Yeah.
We see it. My oldest daughter started a sourdough bread company a little over a year ago called Rise, and it's taken off. And it's hard because, again, we don't even eat that much bread. All the bread that we do eat is 100% sourdough. So, we do baguettes, we do just traditional old loaves, we do sourdough pretzels, which are one of our biggest sellers. Blows people's minds. They can actually eat a pretzel and it can be healthy, but through the whole fermentation process. And what's rewarding for us is that we've had so many people come up. We sell at the farmers market, and we sell here at the Food Lab and a couple other places, a couple of pickup locations, and we have a lot of direct consumer interaction. And they're like, "Look, this is the only bread I can eat. Like, I haven't been able to eat bread for 15 years, and this is the only bread that I can eat." And there's a lot of people. The cool other thing about sourdough is I don't care what we're lost in this. Okay, whole wheat flour, white flour, all this new conversations, and what's lost in that is it yeasted bread, or is it a real sourdough bacteria and yeast fermentation? If it's a yeast fermented bread, I don't care if it's 100% white flour or 100% whole wheat flour, it's in the high glycemic index range. And the sourdough process brings it down into the low range. And that's either white flour or whole wheat flour. Again, another example of a completely different food.
Completely. When I'm looking at a bakery, so like you, honestly, out of the habit, I grew up eating a lot of bread, but then the diet that healed me had zero starch or bread. So I've completely lost the habit of eating bread. So now I have it maybe 4 times a year. I'll have it like when I'm in France, or if I stumble on a bakery that does it correctly. My partner likes to make croissants, but croissants are actually a terrible example, I should say to the audience. Don't go making croissants. I mean, do it if you want to, but they're not a traditional food. They've only been around for 200 years. So unlike sourdough bread, they are not an ancestral food. You can make them healthier, but they're not ancestral. So, so no, but had I, never gotten ill and still eaten kind of the diet that I grew up on and wanted to upgrade it, that's what I would do. Does your daughter's company Rise, do they ship or are they local?
We're right now local, but we're going to start shipping, and we just started getting in. So we're the business, the food production. Let me back up. I'm sorry. What my wife and I are doing is the 3 pillars that we stand on are inspiration. We want to inspire, we want to empower, we want to nourish. And so things like the podcast and the book and those sorts of things are, getting people excited and understand that they can make a change in their own diets and in the health of their families. And then the empowerment part is it's all the classes, it's all the workshops, and we do everything from flint knapping and hunting and foraging classes to butchering and cheese making and sourdough classes, virtual and in person. But the nourishing part is we realize that there's a lot of people that want to make a change that can't or don't have the time to actually make sourdough bread every week for their kids or those. And we want to be able to support that as much as possible. So we're in the midst of building a food production company that right now it's bread and nixtamalized maize, but the focus is we always use those techniques and technologies to make food as safe and nourishing as possible. So whether it's sourdough bread or nixtamalized maize or everything, we have our hands in a lot right now. But right now it's sourdough and nixtamalized maize products.
I'm so grateful. Oh, go on. Mm-hmm.
Oh no, we take a strong stance against refined sugars, and we take a really strong stance against industrial nut and seed oils. So there are a few things that we do. I mean, we use a lot of fat in our foods, and even there's a few things that we even fry, believe it or not. But it's always in high quality animal fat,
awesome.
lard tallow. But to answer your question, right now we're local. We hopefully have the ability to ship fairly soon.
Well, I cannot wait till you ship. You have to let me know the second it happens, because all of my clients that are in remission will be living off of your products.
Thank you.
Thank you. Because that's my rule. I don't let people go back to corn unless it's been through the proper process, because you can stay healthy on those foods and you can thrive on those foods. And they're foods we all enjoy because we were raised on those foods. So it's nice to be able to go back to those and enjoy them and have them as often as you want. So the fact that you'll be providing this for the public is an amazing gift to all of us. Amazing. I cannot thank you enough.
It's my pleasure. Thank again. I know I said it earlier, but I wish I had somebody like you to walk me through healing when I was in the midst of that about 20 years ago, and it would have been so helpful.
Yes, me too. But I figured the reason why neither of us did was that we could stumble and figure this out. And now look at you, you're this wonderful platform of knowledge to help so many people. So it's ended up to be a very good thing on both of our accounts. Okay, let's go back to corn though. So, okay, sure, so with corn, yes, with the corn. So it goes through in the Mexican, the Latin cultures, it would go through kind of like a 5-stage process, right? The soaking, the sprouting, the fermenting, the lye or the lime, the stone grinding, all of that. Am I missing a step, or is that correct?
No, that's it. So first off, the maize itself, the type of maize that it is, makes a huge difference, right? So if you have access to heirloom maize from Mexico or some of the surrounding areas, as with any other food, an heirloom version is usually has more nutrition in it and more character, right? I mean, we eat for a lot of reasons, not just nutrition. We eat for flavor, we eat for texture, we eat for the experience. So an heirloom variety of maize, and so it gets soaked overnight. It gets put in an alkaline solution, a basic solution. It used to be done with a combination of wood ash and water. And just as a quick side note, wood ash has been a part of traditional diets probably for 2 million years. And even so wood ash, and then you can take wood ash and make something called potash, and then you can make potash, and you can make pearl ash, and eventually you end up with things like, believe it or not, baking soda, which is a chemical version of wood ash, which becomes important in just a minute. And then we can do other things and make baking powder. But ash is an important part of food processing. It always has been. And ash was just always around food. I mean, if you're cooking on a fire, ash is there. So they would take the maize and mix it with water and wood ash, simmer it. You bring it to a simmer. You don't have to simmer very long, half an hour or so. Let it sit, put a lid on it, let it sit overnight. And the next day you rinse it. And then you can either use it. At that point, you could call it hominy. If you're in Mexico, you call it nixtamal. You call it pozole. There's a lot of different things you call it, but you could do things to those whole kernels of nixtamalized maize as they are, or you can then grind it and make masa, which is what traditional tortillas and rapes and other sorts of traditional foods in that area are made out of. There's a couple really important things that happen with. Well, I interrupted you. What did you want me to talk about with it? Because I want to talk about what happens.
I want people to know about the processing of corn and all the stages it has to go through, because everyone, as soon as they're better, they're like, can I have popcorn now? That's usually the first question.
So great. Here's the thing with corn. I did this in the middle of Google Europe for a presentation. I can't believe I did it, but let me just back up for just a second and tell you a really quick, really funny story. So I have 3 kids, a daughter, Brianna, 17, my son, Billy's 15, and my youngest daughter, Alyssa's 13. When Alyssa was, this might've been 10 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 or so. I live in a fairly rural area here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and I think it was Christmas Eve, and my wife was, my wife is very, she's amazing, and she wants to make sure everybody's always treated equally, even down to the number of gifts in a stocking level, right, for Christmas. And I understand, it makes sense, but we were one small gift short for Alyssa. Just after we had wrapped everything, she's like, we got to get something for Alyssa. I'm like, okay. And she's like, kid, you need to go to Toys R Us and find a gift. And I'm like, okay. And she goes, and you can't spend more than $5. Wow. Like, you're telling me on Christmas Eve, I had to drive like an hour and a half for a gift for a 5-year-old girl that I'm supposed to figure out what she wants and spend less than $5. It's an impossible mission you're sending me on, but I'll try. So I go to Toys R Us and I'm going through on my cart and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to get. And I turn the corner by, you know what Play-Doh is?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I turned the corner and it was the aisle that had the Play-Doh in it. And I literally saw it. I mean, it almost looked like a movie, like it was like the light was shining on it. I knew exactly what it was and I loved it so much. I got one for her and one for me. This is what it was. It was a Play-Doh kit and it was less than $5. It was a Play-Doh kit. And it had a form. You put the Play-Doh in it, and you close the thing, and it makes the form. And it had a form, and it came with a brown Play-Doh and a small yellow Play-Doh. And the form, you put it in there. It was literally a turd. It was a piece of poop, and it had a corn kernel next to it. So what you made is you made the piece of poop with the brown, and then you made a little yellow corn kernel, and you're supposed to stick the corn kernel on the poop. And I'm like, oh my God, this is perfect. And I know everybody's cringing listening to this, but every single person listening who has eaten corn on the cob has seen whole kernels of corn the next day in the toilet. And we either don't think about it or we giggle or whatever, but there's something wrong. Like, I know we eat for a lot of reasons, but at its heart, at its essence, we eat for nutrition. We eat to nourish our bodies. And that kernel of corn, and I guarantee you, that corn you ate was probably overboiled, overcooked corn, and you ate it and you saw it the next day. You got absolutely no nutrition from that kernel of corn. You saw it. Now, maize, it turns out, is one of the most difficult grains in the world for the human body to not only safely, but efficiently digest. And unless you go through this nixtamalization process, which is the process that we've been talking about for the past few minutes, I don't care whether or not it's corn on the cob, or whether you've ground the corn or boiled the corn or steamed the corn or ground it up and made cornbread out. I don't care what you do to the corn. If you don't nixtamalize it, some of the nutrition passes through your body and you don't get access to it. And again, it may not seem like a big deal, but I'll tell you, has been a huge deal historically. And I'll tell you, if we have time, I'll tell you a quick little story, which is tragic, really. But so maize, it looks like, was domesticated somewhere probably between 10 and 15,000 years ago in the Balsas Valley of Mexico. And it was when the domestication process started with grass. I mean, corn is literally grass. And if you saw the wild ancestor to corn, which still grows in areas in Mexico, it looks like what happens to your lawn if you don't mow it, right? And it just starts to get a seed head on. I mean, that's literally what it looks like. So our people beginning 10 to 15,000 years ago were selectively picking this maize or this corn, planting it so that it went through different genetic mutations to get to the kind of corn we think about today. And some of these mutations were really, some were size, some were starch content. If you look at a grass seed, which again, it's a grass, all the individual seeds, kernels of the grass are in its own sheath. And one of the great mutations that actually, hold on, can I give you 30? I want to get something to show you. Hold on a second.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds really good.
Okay, hold on. I'm so excited I thought of this, so that I knew I had it. Okay, so if you think this is an heirloom variety of maize from Oaxaca, Mexico, and anybody who's seen corn, it has the big sheath on the outside. You pull it down when you husk it, and you get something that looks kind of like this. Well, this is an ancient variety of maize, and if you look at it, every single
it looks like a flower.
It does, and every single kernel has its own sheath, right? Yes. So one of the genetic mutations was to go from this to this, so that you didn't have to husk every little tiny kernel. So those are the kind of things that happened over time.
That would have taken an enormous amount of time to make that into a piece of food.
Oh, absolutely. So these kind of things are happening, but at the same time, there's as humans introduce a new food and they begin to form a relationship with that food and understand the best way to turn this resource that I'm telling you human bodies have absolutely no business eating into something that can be safe and nourishing. And this is happening over thousands of years. They realize there's a processing method that's required, and it's that nixtamalization process. Now, entire civilizations that all of us around the world learn about in school, like the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas and the Olmec, those are civilizations that are built on maize. It's not like they ate a bunch of other stuff and a little bit of maize. It's like they ate a massive amount of maize and a little bit of other stuff. So they were doing something right with the maize. And there's when European explorers came to the Americas, they found the maize. Maize is spread into North America and all different parts of North America, especially Eastern North America, where the colonists first came over to. They saw the maize, they liked the maize, it tasted good, it was easy to grow, and they're like, we're taking this back to Europe. And they do. They take the maize back to Europe. And not long after the maize comes back to Europe, people started getting really, really sick. And there was a disease called pellagra that would follow in the path of maize everywhere it was introduced. Now, the good thing about maize is that it's easy to grow, it tastes really good, and it's really, really filling. The bad thing about maize is that it tastes really good, it's easy to grow, and it's really, really filling. So when it comes into communities that were at some level having difficulty feeding themselves for whatever reason, it tends to dominate the diet. So areas that were not necessarily doing great, but were getting their food from a variety of different sources, all of a sudden now just eat maize, like literally just eat maize. And when that happens, people start getting very, very sick, right? A sickness that you don't see in the Americas. There's no archaeological or ethnographic evidence that Native Americans were suffering from this disease, even though they were eating massive amounts of maize. And it first shows up it first is identified in Spain in the 1700s, and then it's identified in Italy. This disease, when maize spreads to Italy, and again also in the 1700s, and that's where it gets its name pellagra, which in Italian means sour skin. And this disease, just so you know, some of the first symptoms are red, rashy, scaly skin, and then like these scabby things would start to fall off, and it resembled leprosy at some level. You'd bleed from the mouth, your skin would get pale, and you'd eventually go blind and die if it's left untreated. It spreads throughout Eastern North America. There's some suggestions that some of the mythology or stories around vampires were happening at this time, and it may be a result of this, bleeding from the mouth, aversion to sunlight, those sorts of things. That might be a stretch, but there's some suggestions. So this is happening. Millions of people getting affected by this and getting sick, hundreds of thousands dying over several hundred years. We see it in Ireland at the end of the Irish potato famine, when America starts sending massive amounts of corn or maize over to Ireland as famine relief food. And even though people were not getting sick, some of these people were not getting sick and dying from not eating anything, they're getting sick and dying from this new disease that they've never seen in Ireland. And then probably one of the biggest and most dramatic impacts was in the early 20th century, back in America, where maize first came from. In the 1920s and 1930s, you have massive amounts of people in the American Southeast and states like Alabama and Georgia and the Carolinas who are focused on eating corn. Corn is king. Corn is the major part of their diets. People are getting sick and dying from the same disease. And we hired an infectious disease doctor by the name of Joseph Goldberger, and said, I don't know why, America said, we don't know why all these people are dying. Go in and study it. And he's an infectious disease doctor, and he goes in and he studies it, and he comes back and he's like, look, I am an infectious disease doctor, and I can tell you this isn't an infectious disease. I think it's diet related, and I think it has to do with corn. And they're like, you're out of your mind. Something this bad can't be diet related. I mean, how many times have we heard something like that? So they send him back, and they said, figure out what's wrong. And he's convinced. He knew it had to do with maize, or knew it had to do with some sort of diet related thing, and he thought it had to do with maize. He'd read some of these accounts of pellagra in Italy, and he started to draw a link there. So what he did was he took several mental institutions and several prisons and divided the populations in there in half, and fed half of them nothing but corn, and the other half discontinued whatever diets that they had. And the people that were being fed nothing but corn presented with this disease. And he went back and he's like, look, I have this evidence. And we're like, that's not enough. Like, it can't be just this. Figure it out. It has to be infectious to be this bad. So he and his partner and his wife would hold these parties called filth parties. And this was a disease that usually hit impoverished areas, was usually associated with poverty and anyhow, it was called a filth disease because you were very embarrassed if someone in your family got this. So he held these things called filth parties, and he gathered a lot of people around, and he brought some people that were suffering from this disease in, and he and his wife and his partner would take a cotton swab, and he'd swab the mucous membranes of the people that were sick, and he'd swab, himself and his wife and his partner with it. And then he would take the skin, the actual falling off skin and scabs and things, and they would eat it. They would consume it. And then they'd also take blood from the victims and put it directly into their bodies just to show that it wasn't infectious. And finally, people started to believe him. And in the 1930s, there were a few scientists that figured out that it was caused by a deficiency of niacin in the diet. And then the reaction to all this, I mean, we're talking in America alone, in a period of just a few decades, we had millions of people get sick from this, hundreds of thousands die. We figured out that it had something to do with corn and the deficiency of niacin in the diet. And you know what we did? We said, we have to fortify all baked goods with niacin. That was our reaction. We didn't change anything. We didn't realize that maize has been around for at least 10,000 years, and nobody started getting sick until the 1700s from it. We just start fortifying all baked goods with niacin. So whether it's a bread or cornbread, and you see niacin on the label, it's because of this situation. Well, here's the crazy part. So It is. It's a deficiency of niacin in the diet that causes pellagra. But the crazy part of the story is that maize has niacin. It actually has quite a bit of niacin in it. So for several hundred years, we have millions of people around the world getting sick, hundreds of thousands dying from a nutrient deficiency while eating massive quantities of a food that contain that nutrient. That nutrient is literally passing directly through their bodies, and they're putting it into the toilet and getting sick and dying. And the only this just shows the power of food processing properly. This
Completely.
wasn't an issue in the past.
Completely. And that makes so much sense. I really find so many conditions we start to see a rise of really after the industrial era and also after the colonial era, where people were going to other countries, grabbing a food like corn, bringing it back and losing the processing method in the process. We're seeing that a lot in Africa. I can walk down the street only in cities. I don't see this in any of the more traditional communities, but if I walk into a city in Zimbabwe and South Africa, any of these regions, you can actually see a lot of the deficiency diseases caused by the lack of processing of these foods. And for no extra cost, we can, if everyone knew how to actually process these foods, we could be avoiding a lot of these health issues that people are having. So yeah, I think that's a perfect story to highlight how important food processing is. And I can only imagine what the mental health would have been like at that time, because niacin deficiencies are deeply correlated with things like schizophrenia, addiction. In fact, Bill, who started Alcoholics Anonymous, a huge part of his program while he was alive was high-dose niacin therapy. And of course, I would recommend that in food as opposed to in supplemental form. But high amounts of niacin are very helpful for turning off, really calming the areas of the brain that deal with addiction. And unfortunately, when he passed away, that was lost with the program. It wasn't a conspiracy. I think people just didn't realize how important the nutritional aspect of Alcoholics Anonymous was. And as many people will know, of course, this isn't a discouragement from doing any of this 12-step programs, but many people know that the success rate is not high, which is why it's not published, right? It's very low now, and it used to have very high success rates. So whether or not the niacin is why or not is left to be seen, but I wouldn't be surprised with how correlated it is with mental health. So yeah, I bet the mental health would have really been pretty horrific during that time as well.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. I tell you, let me tell you another. This is not a nice story. This is a quick one, I promise. A couple of years ago, they were having an issue in France with wild hamsters. So I guess hamsters are wild in France, and farmers rely on hamsters to aerate the soil. They live in the fields and they burrow and they aerate the soil, and it's very good for their crops. But they noticed, and this is only 4 or 5 years ago, they started noticing that there was a huge, massive hamster die-off. All these populations were dropping, and when they went in and studied what they realized was that these hamsters were, when they were giving birth, quite a number of the births weren't successful, but the ones that were, the parents would turn around and cannibalize their young, and they'll eat their young, and they didn't understand why this was happening, and they realized, well, they had started to plant much more corn in France, and this was happening in the cornfields, and these hamsters were eating corn. And when they turned around and actually they did studies on the hamsters and actually supplemented their diets with niacin, everything stopped. They stopped cannibalizing their young. The populations grew again. And again, it's just one other example. So real quick with the masa, I just want to give a takeaway for people that is helpful. Number one, that process, I know I mentioned wood ash. It can be done very easily with, now it's done with something called cal or calcium hydroxide. It can be done with lye. It can be done with sodium hydroxide. It can be done with several different things, including pickling lime, which is very easy to get at places even like Walmart. So the nixtamalization process is very easy to do in your own house. The problem, there's something called maseca, or dried masa flour, which you can buy in a lot of places around the world, which is what most tortillas today are made from. Now, I will say a quick caveat is that most of that has been through the nixtamalization process. So if you buy masa flour, it's been through that on an industrial scale. It's a little different, but it's been through that process. Here's the unfortunate part. The difference between taking kernels, other than the connection to your food and control over the ingredients and the process yourself, which you get by making it yourself, there is another issue. There's several reasons why when grains are milled, that they only keep the starch part, and you get things like white flour, right? And they take the germ and the bran out. And the main reason is because the fat is in the germ, and when they compromise that through grinding, the oils are released, and then they can go rancid. So the shelf life drops. So that's why we've fooled people into thinking they should just like white flour anyhow because of a texture and whatever thing. But the main reason is because on the industrial food scale, if they take the germ out and just give you the white flour, it can sit on a shelf for 5 years, right? It's the same with the maize. So with the maseca, with the masa flour that you can buy and make and just add water to and make tortillas from, it's been through the nixtamalization process, but it's been degerminated. So most of the nutrition that's there in the maize is not there in that in the masa flour. It's also the flavor isn't there, the texture isn't there. So there's a lot of other reasons, but from a nutritional level, it still makes a lot of sense to do this yourself than to go to the grocery store and get the maseca.
Totally agree. Or get it from you, obvious.
No, certainly order from us.
A couple more things I want to talk to you about, because I could actually talk to you for like 20 hours straight. But okay, what about the history of blood? I was fascinated when I was with the Maasai just recently, how good blood tasted coming from Ohio, right?
Never Is that where you're from?
I am, and you went to college in Ohio, correct?
I did. I went to Ohio State. Where are you from in Ohio?
So Dayton, Ohio.
I know Dayton well.
Yeah, my sister lives in Columbus. One of them does, and one of my other sisters, her husband taught at Ohio for a long time, Ohio State.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. History of,
I'm just a little Ohio girl, so never had blood before, and I know blood sausage is a European thing, but I was shocked at how delicious and lovely blood was with the Maasai, and this was fresh, very fresh. Like the animal had been slaughtered and was actually still in the dying process when I had my first cup. We had it several times on the trip, but it was like a custard. It was sweet and lovely. It wasn't like metal or anything that I would have expected. What is the history of blood consumption, if you know?
That's a great question. It's hard to, so I don't know. Archaeologically, it's very difficult to tell because getting blood doesn't really leave any traces. Mm-hmm. And it's important for people to understand this. And certainly when we talk about diets in the past, those diets are built, our reconstruction of those diets are built on several different things. One of it is our interpretation of the archaeological record, which, the further back you go in time, the less evidence there is. And it's scarce, but we can still tell a lot of different things. But it's a combination of that and looking at living groups today that are still carrying on certain traditions, using similar kinds of tools that we find in the archaeological record, those sorts of things. Butchering is very easy to see in the archaeological record. When you take a stone knife or a metal knife and you butcher an animal, you're scraping against the bones. The bones will often last in the archaeological record, and we can use microscopes and look and see exactly where those cut marks are on the bones, what direction the things are being cut. What things like if you kill an animal, if you hunt an animal and kill it over here, depending on who you are or what you value from that animal, some of the stuff gets eaten on the premises, some of the stuff gets cut off and carried back to camp, and everything from looking at the distribution of those bones, which bones are left at the kill site, which bones make it back to the village, those sorts of things all help us piece together these really comprehensive pictures of our dietary past. But something like blood is incredibly difficult to see how it's being used, right? So we could potentially see blood, or we can see blood in uses as a basis for the binder isn't the right word, as a platform for different pigments and paints and things for cave paintings. We can see, if it's not too old, it's only several thousand years, we can look at stone tools themselves, and we can actually do a blood residue analysis to see if there's blood on those tools, and often what species of animal it comes from. The problem is that doesn't mean it was being consumed. It means something was cutting into that animal. But your experience with the Maasai, I had a very similar experience with the Samburu. It was mind blowing. We didn't kill the animal. We let the blood from the neck and then mixed it with milk and drank the blood there. So there's certainly those practices that are still being carried on. But you mentioned Europe. Blood sausage, blood pudding is a common food still today. You can get it in the airport in Dublin. I mean, there is, right? So what's cool too is there's a saying in southwestern Ireland in County Kerry called that says, "Kerry cows know it's Sunday." That's the saying. And there's a special heritage breed of cows that they keep in that area of Ireland. And during the famine on Sundays, and this is how the story is told, but I think it was something that was more common practice both before and after the famine as well. But during the famine, Sundays, they would literally do exactly what the Maasai and the Samburu do with these cows. In the middle of Ireland, they would actually let the blood from the neck of the cows.
I had no idea.
Yep, they do the same thing. And here's something that's fascinating. And again, I know I'm talking about Ireland quite a bit. I just know the Irish history and prehistory more than some other areas. Dairy makes it into Ireland a little over 6,000 years ago. It's another 1,000 years until there's any farming going on in Ireland. So I know we look at Europe and we look at Ireland and we think oats and barley and wheat and all these other sorts of things and farming communities and all these, but there's 1,000-year period of time in Ireland. And I know some Irish archaeologists very well, and some that recently came to Africa to study the Maasai, that are looking to the Maasai as examples of what Ireland might have looked like for those 1,000 years. I mean, cattle come in pre-agriculture, before any plants, before any barley, before anything like that at all. So there's a period of time where you have literally hunter-gatherers that are now have domesticated cattle that are living without farming anything whatsoever, and are probably, and the houses actually, the house patterns look very similar to, and the way the villages seem to be laid out look very similar to the Maasai. That's why they're checking those out as well.
That makes so much sense, honestly. I remember reading an article maybe back in 2008 about a Scottish man who had a big plot of land, but he couldn't grow any land on it, as is often the case in many parts of Scotland. And it was too mineral rich, too rocky. And so instead he had animals on it. Instead, it's much easier to have animals eating the grasses than to grow grains in a lot of parts of the world. So that fully makes sense, but I have to go see this bloodletting. That is fascinating. We did both. We did the bloodletting where the animal stays perfectly healthy. And then when they slaughter an animal for the whole community to eat, that's when they drink the fresh. So they never slaughter an animal just for the blood. It's just a byproduct of the slaughtering process. But so it was nice. We got to have it with and without the milk. I preferred it without, shockingly enough.
Did you really?
I did. I actually did. Everybody else preferred it with the milk, but I'm oddly wanting to go back for that and all the bugs. I know you talk about bugs a lot. I am in love with eating bugs. It's like eating popcorn or like candy, depending on how it's cooked, and it's wonderful in savory dishes as well. And a lot of my friends in Zimbabwe, they'll eat it just fresh without even cooking them. But I've mostly done the cooked methods.
What is the ones, when we were in South Africa, we had them, and I the name's escaping me. They're about yay big.
Mumbelly worms?
Say it again.
Is it the mumbelly worms?
Yeah, and they almost they're sort of dehydrated. They kind of taste like beef jerky. Yeah. I mean, yes.
Yeah, you can get those anywhere. Yeah, and everybody looks forward to them too. I often get misunderstood, and people will think that, oh, it's just people are just hungry, and that's why they're eating these bugs. But no, it is something everyone looks forward to, no matter what culture. What I think you would know this better. But I think something that's not understood well about Africa, even just South Africa or just Zimbabwe, or take any country, is that we think it's very much monoculture, and it's so diverse. There's often well over 100 different cultures or languages spoken in one little area, all with different dietary habits and lifestyle habits and all sorts of things. It's incredibly diverse. So it's not the case that people eat bugs out of starvation. It's actually, at least in my experience, and I'm certainly not an expert, but here it's out of enjoyment. They're actually really delicious. Yes.
We went to Thailand to do some work with bugs. The whole family went several years ago, and we spent a lot of, and what I wanted to do was do work in, find out, there was a great restaurant called Insects in the Backyard. And it was, I don't know if it ever got a Michelin star, but it was Michelin star level, serving bugs where they're not hiding them. They're actually celebrating not only the nutritional part of bugs, but the flavor and the textures and the visual appeal. It was brilliant. I wanted to do that. I wanted to spend time in markets and just see how people in an urban area that had access to these open markets in Bangkok were consuming and buying and purchasing and dealing with insects. And then we spent time in very rural areas with an insect ant farmer in villages where it was wonderful. So I wanted to experience all of those things. But the cool thing, and I say it all the time, in Bangkok at the markets, these markets, bugs, insects everywhere. And the people that were, and this speaks to something you just said, the people that were buying the insects, it wasn't like they were walking up and only had a tiny bit of money and put a little bit of money down and got a bag of crickets and walked home and then fed this to their family. They were coming to the insect stand with their arms laden with bags of food, meat and vegetables and things that they bought in other parts of the market, and they were buying the bugs. It wasn't that was all they had to eat or all they could afford. It was something that they wanted to eat.
Yes, it's a treat that is looked forward to, and they're seasonal too. So the different kind of bugs, like you can't just come and be like, oh, I want to try the bugs, because a lot of times, even if they're on the menu, they won't be there. It depends what bug is in season and what you can get. And yeah, it's the best. But yeah, definitely it is a sought after food. Okay, 2 questions I can imagine the audience is asking. One, in the beginning, you mentioned that Mongolians often are lactose intolerant. Now, I think I can answer this for you, but I'd rather have it from your own mouth. They eat dairy just fine as long as it's cultured, correct?
Yes, because it's processed, and through the fermentation process, the lactose, 2 things. One is the lactose is either non-existent or at a very low level because it's been consumed through the fermentation process. So it's a naturally lactose-free food. And 2, the lactase is actually the enzyme that we're lacking. If we're lactose intolerant, the enzyme that we can't produce is actually present in that finished food. So when you consume a naturally fermented raw dairy food, not only does it either have no or little lactose in it, but you're also consuming that enzyme lactase, which helps further digest some of it. Now, it doesn't stay in your body like forever, but it will help digest that. And some people suggest it'll be around long enough that it'll help you consume dairy for hours after you've consumed it.
Awesome. And then one last thing. Earlier, you mentioned lots of foods that we were not meant to eat. We went through lots of them. We didn't go over meat. Tell us about that.
Okay. So I want to make sure I say it the right way. I didn't mean to say we were not biologically designed to, if you think about our body, if you stripped yourself down completely naked and said, okay, what do I eat? This is all I have to work with. From getting the food to consuming the food, to digesting the food, to making use of all the nutrients in that food. If you start from that level, and that's where I think we really need to start from when we think about food and diet and health as humans, then our options are really, really limited. So the technological innovations over 3.5 million years that our ancestors have developed allow us to overcome those limitations and access new foods from our environment that we couldn't access with just our fingers or our teeth. And most importantly, transform them into their safest and most nourishing forms possible. Meat is very difficult for humans to get and access without any tools whatsoever. That's what I meant. So red meat is, and let's look at it from a nutrient density and nutrient bioavailability perspective, because that, from a safety perspective too, but from animals, if the animal's healthy and it's freshly killed, safety isn't really an issue, right? So let's put the safety thing aside. Safety is a huge issue with grains, right? Safety is a huge issue with those, but let's put safety aside for just a minute, because we don't have to worry about it with animals. From a nutrient density and nutrient bioavailability perspective, you've got a fresh kill in front of you, tons of red meat. What are we really looking at? Well, first of all, you have to get into that animal. So you need a tool to rip it. And I'm not talking about a little mouse. I mean, like something like a kudu or, a large animal. It's very difficult for us to rip into an animal like that, even if we use our teeth. So a sharp edge, a stone tool certainly helped our ancestors, would certainly help us as well. But once you're into that animal, the most nutrient dense, bioavailable foods in that animal is the blood and the fat and the organs. And those foods, whether you consume them raw, like we just talked about, or whether you cook them, or do a whole bunch of different things with them, their nutrients are readily available to us. Like you can just dive right in and eat a liver, or you can take that liver and cut it up and cook it, and your body's able to access those nutrients about the same way. We like the textures and flavors of one maybe over another sometimes, but you don't have to do anything to that liver to get all the nutrition. I mean, compare that to like the maize, where it's a completely different story. But so the blood, the fat, and the organs are very not only nutrient dense, but they're bioavailable on their own. All we needed was a sharp edge to kill that animal and to cut it open and to access it. The meat, while it is incredibly nutrient dense and incredibly bioavailable, it isn't as nutrient dense and bioavailable as the organs. In fact, if you're looking at that animal, of the edible parts, the flesh or the meat is one of the least nutrient dense parts of the animal. It's more nutrient dense than anything else around that animal, all the grass and the other stuff, but it is not as nutrient dense as the organs, the blood, and the fat. Now, there's a guy named Richard Wrangham out of Harvard he's a fantastic primatologist, and he's done a lot. He wrote a great book called Fire, and he's done a lot of work looking at the bioavailability of meat. And red meat is, our body has to work pretty hard to break it down. If we just took a hunk of raw meat and took a couple bites of it and swallowed it, our body has to work fairly hard to access all of the nutrients from it. And again, remember, I'm a huge advocate of eating meat. What I'm saying is, on a scale of nutrient density and bioavailability, the flesh, red meat, needs a little bit of work for us to fully and easily access all the nutrients. It turns out that a little bit of cooking does help release it. So, and it's probably no coincidence that 2 million years ago, when we first developed hunting technology and fire technology, that's when our bodies exponentially grow and our brains exponentially grow, and a lot of things change. So a little bit of cooking helps, and anything we can do to that meat to pre-break it down, even physically, before we eat it, certainly helps. So if you go to a high dollar restaurant and order raw meat, you're getting it one of two ways, right? Carpaccio or tartare. Carpaccio, it's sliced paper thin, and tartare, it's chopped up like hamburger. That helps our bodies access the nutrients in it, and our guts to work less hard. If you look at chimpanzees, when they do eat raw red meat, they'll often take a leaf and eat it at the same, and consume this special leaf, I forget the name of it, with the raw meat at the same time. And the leaf comes from a plant that has a high silica content. It's almost like sandpaper. And he's done work here, when they eat it and this leaf shreds up, the leaf actually helps physically break the meat down as they're chewing it, and helps them fully digest it. So I didn't mean to suggest that we shouldn't eat meat. What I meant was, meat was only available to us in any quantity that allowed it to do anything in our diets after we created the tools necessary to harvest flesh from a scavenged kill. It didn't make a difference in our diet. And that was 3.5 million years ago. Animals didn't really make a huge difference in our diet until about 2 million years ago, when we developed hunting technology. And when we developed hunting technology, that meant We could take an animal down at will. And most importantly, we had first access to the most nutrient-dense bioavailable parts, the blood, the fat, and the organs, which is the parts that are not there on scavenged animals because the predator that killed that animal ate those parts before we got there. So animals, I'm convinced animals, organs, and I say animals, not meat, animals, blood, fat, organs, and meat and marrow are what essentially are when we introduce those in our diets, those are the things that essentially made us human.
I totally agree. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, such a proponent of doing the organ meats, the marrow, the skin, whole nose to tail. It's so important. You're absolutely right. The muscle meat is the least important, even though that's our favorite usually. So tell us all about your new book coming out.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. So I have a new book that is pre-sale right now. It comes out November 14th, 16th, I think the 14th. It's called Eat Like a Human. And the entire book is, well, really, we talk about a lot of the sorts of things that are in the book. The book breaks down our dietary past over 5 million years. It starts off by breaking it down that allows in a very easy way to understand the relationship between changes in diets, changes in technology, and changes in our bodies that eventually created us as humans. And then the rest of the book, it's broken down into food categories, from plants to animals to grains to dairy, across the board. And in each chapter, we talk about the history and prehistory of those foods, really boil down how those foods have changed over time and what they really are in our grocery stores and in our modern diets today. And then most importantly, it takes that information and provides real world takeaways, tips and techniques and recipes to apply in your own home, in your own kitchen, to make use of these ancestral approaches to food that are essential to feeding your family the most nourishing diets possible. Now, you cut out for a minute. Did you miss any of that?
We didn't lose the sound at all. We're good. It was my camera died, my battery died. So we're going to switch to my computer. But I, for one, cannot wait for your book. Like, literally cannot wait. I pre-ordered. Everyone needs to buy it right now because this is the information that we've been missing, right? It's not so easy as just eat paleo, just eat grain-free, or just eat the way your grandparents ate. It's actually the way it's produced that's so important, and these nuances are what have been really missing. I find so often when a big diet hits the market and someone's pushing it, they'll just say go dairy-free, when actually dairy can be a wonderful health food if it's done correctly, or go grain-free, when that can be a wonderful health food as well. So, and it can be a vehicle for wonderful health foods like bone marrow. So, I really can't wait for your book. It's the book that I wish I would have written. So I'm so glad that you did, because I don't have the time. Yeah. Okay. One last question that sure. I want to leave with all your travels. I know we've mainly focused on Mongolia, a bit of the Mexico, and of course Ireland, but you've really been all over the whole world. Who is the group that you've seen be the healthiest around the world?
Truth, the Sunborough. I awesome. Remember the moment we saw. There were 3 youth. They were probably late teens that were waiting for us when we came up this wadi, this dried riverbed. It took us several days to actually get to the village, but when we got there, I remember looking up and seeing them. And to me, and it could have been the sun, it could have been the whole sort of, just romanticness of being where we were and everything we were about to do. But I remember looking at them and thinking to myself, they are the ideal human form. From their eyes and how white they were, to their teeth and their broad faces and their slim but healthy athletic bodies. Unbelievable. I've been around a lot of healthy people around the world, but they're what stick out to me.
That's awesome. The Samburu, for our listeners, they're in Kenya. They're hard to get to. You usually have to take a flight or do a serious drive to get there. Most people land in the major airport and then drive north to get to the Samburu. They're very similar to the Maasai in diet, but they are their own group. The Samburu are incredible. Thank you so much, Dr. Schindler. I can't thank you enough for your time, for your illumination and excitement on this topic, and inspiration to all the listeners. It has been a true pleasure.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you so much.